Hello everybody. In this lecture we will talk about narrative analysis. It will be an introduction to narrative analysis because we will stay with this topic for 3 following lectures. As a form of introduction, let's look at some famous narratives. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived in a village near the forest. Whenever she went out, the little girl wore a red riding cloak, so everyone in the village called her Little Red Riding Hood. So, you know this story, this narrative is about Little Red Riding Hood and wolf and grandmother, and this is the story. The second story is from different culture. Now the Sultan Shahryar had a wife whom he loved more than all the world, and his greatest happiness was to surround her with splendor and to give her the finest dresses and the most beautiful jewels. It was therefore with the deepest shame and sorrow that he accidentally discovered, after several years, that she had deceived him completely, and her whole conduct turned out to have been so bad that he felt himself obliged to carry out the law of the land and order the Grand Vizier to put her to death. So this is a beginning of a large collection of stories which is known as, 1001 Night, the famous Arabic stories from the Middle Age. Third story to enter the topic is: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, let there be light. So this is the story of creation of earth in Bible. So another very strong story which is contested by science and defended as metaphoric by Christians, and the debate still is going on about creationism and how world and living organism and human being emerged. Another story: the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstruction of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So you probably know this story of class struggle from or written by Marx and Engels in their famous Communist Manifesto. This is also very, very strong story, and we will deal with this story you will deal somehow with this story in your homework. The last example is Also the story, which is not starting as a big story, but it's about a big issue. On a visit to Beirut during the terrible civil war of 1975-1976, a French journalist wrote regretfully of the gutted downtown area that it had once seemed to belong to the Orient of Chateaubriand and Nerval. He was right about the place, of course, especially so far as a European was concerned. The Orient was almost a European invention and had been since antiquity, a place of romance, exotic beings, haunting memories and landscapes, remarkable experiences. Now it was disappearing. In a sense, it had happened. Its time was over. So, do you know the story told by Edward Said in his famous book Orientalism? How West invented, like Orient as European invention. Also, his explanation begins with this story. So, stories are important part of our life, but not only these huge stories about history, about creation of world, about paradigmatic stories about relationship between generations and male and female. We have also very little stories that permeates our everyday life. For example, this joke. My boss walked past my desk and asked me, "Why are you not working?" I replied, "Because I never saw you coming, sir." So, this is story of our everyday life, and we understand it and we use it if it's the time. So we may ask, or we should ask, in this course, why study narrative, or why study storytelling, stories? What is the matter? And the main argument I present here is that no society can exist without narratives, either everyday situational storytelling or myth or other grand narratives of history, of nationhood, the mythical beginning of nationhood, or this is from the Czech history, which is absolutely mythical, but taken as part of the history, real history. And that the fact that no society can exist without narratives is saying that stories, or is related to another fact, that stories are primary form by which human experience is made meaningful, both retrospectively, when we think about past, but also prospectively, when we think about our future, that we imagine our future in the form of stories, or what will happen. So narratives provide member of the society with understanding of the world they live in. It's a way how we understand our world we live in. And this is the reason why we should research narratives, because through researching narratives we can learn how people in society understand what's going on in their lives, and not only in the way they understand it for themselves, but also how they prepare it, how they make it to be understood by other people. So we are telling stories to be understood We are telling stories about our lives, or we are telling stories about our society, what's going on in our society, and we tell them to be accepted, to be received and understood, and we try to convince other people by telling stories. So this is the main reason. And what are narratives? Narratives, as I already demonstrated, there are different types. There are plethora of narratives, of types of narratives, as personal stories, jokes, autobiographies, historiography. All historiography are narratively done. The history of nations, societies, cities, parties. Every history is a form of narrative. TV series, fairy tales, organization stories. Almost all organizations have the story of the origin, like how it started, how our organization started. Frequently, the story begins with some modest resources. 1, 2, 3 people with modest resources began creating an organization, and today we are a multinational corporation with thousands of employees. So there are a lot of kinds of narratives, but not all communication is narration, or not all communication results in narratives. We have, for example, what I'm doing now is not narrating, is explaining, or describing, or defining. So we have lists, we have instructions, descriptions. We have also a big amount of texts or communication that are not narratives. So we must not consider all text or communication, verbal communication, as narration. Therefore, I present a minimal definition of narrative. So if we want to define, or if we want to determine what is narrative and what is not narrative, we can use this minimal definition. Narrative is a method of recapitulating past experience by matching a verbal sequence of clauses to the sequence of events which actually occurred. This definition comes from William Labov. We will speak about him in next class, in next lecture. And the definition is portrayed in this 2 lines scheme, that we have reality and what happened in event A, next event B, next event C, till event X. And in speech we represent the sequence of events as we say, A happened, next happened B, next happened C, etc. So the minimal definition of narrative is that we represent sequence of events by speech, that we make the same sequence in our speech. And this is this minimal definition. I have one not criticism but limitation. It has one limitation, that it's only about past events, past experience. We can have also narratives about future, about prediction, what will happen, and we can do the same representation of events, but the reality is not reality that happened, but reality that will happen, or we think it will happen. Tomorrow I will go to the university and I will have a class, even if there will be restriction about etc. This is how I recount, or I narrate the future, what will happen in the future. But most of narratives, the really vast majority of narratives, is about past experience, what will happen in past. So it is a good definition of narrative, the minimal one. And there is an example of using the definition to identify a narrative. This comes from newspapers, and there is an article. Sherry Sims was surveying the damage to her Stewart Road home and property when a group of men in trucks hauling backhoes, tractors and bobcats pulled up. The first event. Second event following the first. The 20 men from Denevent and Bufford Slayton farms in Pulaski unloaded and went to work cutting limbs with chainsaws and clearing debris as fast as their vehicles could move. So this is a narration. We represent what happened by sequence of two events. The first event, Sherry Sims surveying the damage. The second, 20 men unloading it from a truck. But it's not all the time as simple as in this example, where the sequence of events that happened in reality is represented by same sequence of in the text, by same sequence of events in the text. And just up in the same newspaper, on the same page, we can find this article where it starts chronologically. It starts with Jerry was at the very end of the first part of the article, because it continues. But this is what is on the first page, on the front page. So it begins chronologically. The first event is put on the end of the narrative. Jerry was at work in Russellville when the tornado hit Franklin County before making its destructive path to where Katie was with her mother-in-law. So the first, Jerry was at work at the moment of the tornado hit his city or his house. Next, there is house gone, mom trapped. That was the text message, paramedic Jerry, etc. So first he was work, next he sent SMS. And third, what Katie Yarbrough didn't realize at the time was that she had a 2x4 stuck 3 inches into lower right side of her back. What we can see, above. So there is reordering of events in narrative. So the narrative must not necessarily follow, or need not necessarily follow, the sequence of event, how it happened in the same chronological sequence, but it can reorganize it, reorder it. And we can see it in this, from the same newspaper, another story. So imagine we have 3 articles, and 3 articles are 3 stories. Different stories about different things, but 3 stories. This article is about US forces killing Bin Laden. The chronology of what happened in the past is well known. Is that first terrorists attacked on World Trade Center. Next chain of events happened. US entered in wars. This is what I take from the article, but I ordered it in chronological order. And next, after US entered in war, next US forces attacked on Osama bin Laden. Next, Osama bin Laden died. Next, after his death, Obama announced that he died, he was killed, and eventually a jubilant crowd outside the White House celebrated this event. This is chronological order. In the newspaper, we can see that, I hope it is visible, that it starts by point 5, next 6, after 4, next 7, next 1, 2, 3. So it's completely reordered. It started death of Osama bin Laden, next Obama's announcement, next attack on Osama bin Laden, next crowd celebrating it, next attack on World Trade Center, next chain of events, and next United States entered into wars in Afghanistan. We can see how flexible narrating is, that still, if we read it, we can reconstruct the story, what happened. We know the chronology from the narrative, but the narrative is not representing the chronology in the way of text is proceeding, is running. So text is ordered in different way, but nevertheless we can understand or we can extract the real chronology of what happened. We can extract the story from the article, from the text, and that leads us to the elaborated definition of narrative. I already told you the elementary or minimal definition of narrative, that there are 2 sequences, one sequence of events, the second sequence of representation of events in the narrative, and this is the elaborated definition of a narrative. And in this elaborated definition, we make distinction between story and plot. If we go back, the real chronology of events is story, and but what author of this article did is that he reordered the story to make a plot, to make some discourse about what happened, and thus created a narrative. So there is a distinction between story and plot in the narrative. Story is the chronological sequence of events as happened. This is story, as I reconstructed it from the article about Obama death. And secondly, there is a plot, sometimes called discourse, which is the arrangement of events into narrative, how it is assembled to produce a narrative and to be worth telling, to be interesting for listeners or readers. And to explain the distinction between story and plot, I use the cave metaphor. Maybe you know cave metaphor from Plato. I use it to explain the elaborated definition of narrative. You can imagine that you are in a cave, and in a cave there is a darkness. You cannot see anything, and the cave is the story. The whole cave is the story. It exists. It's a hole in earth, in rock. It's cave. And there is a guide who has lamp, and and to guide us, he just illuminate some parts of the cave to either show us the interesting parts of the cave, but also to show us the way to go, not to fall into holes. So what is illuminated by the guide, by the narrator is going and illuminated some parts of the cave. This is a plot, just some parts of the story. The guide cannot illuminate what is not in the cave. He is limited, his lamp, to put light just on parts of the cave. He cannot jump off the cave. So the narrator is illuminated some part of stories and creating a plot or discourse, creating the narrative. And we can listen to the same narrative, or we can listen to the same story narrated again and again in different form. The one story can be narrated in different form, and we can enjoy it as we enjoy going through a cave several times with different guides who illuminates different things, different parts of the cave. And when we enlight all cave, we see the whole, we see what is in the back, what is in the front, and this is, we cannot create a narrative in this way because everything is known, everything is seen. This is way how we describe things. This is a description. We can describe it, but not narrate. To narrate, we need a narrator who is illuminated just some part of the cave. This is so by creating plot or by discursive means, illuminating some part of the story. I hope it is understandable. We can go even back. This is the story, how what happened, and the author of this article created a narrative with some plot to be interesting to be interesting for readers, or he created a discourse of the story, choosing some words, metaphors, reordering the sequence of events to be interesting as narrative. When we know what is narrative, minimal definition, elaborated definition, we can reflect on what do narratives tell us about society. And it depends on approach we take to studying narrative. We can distinguish two of approaches, the realistic one and the constructivist one. The realistic approach understands narrative as a representation of human experience. Narratives represent something. For example, in the article about celebrating Bin Laden's death, it represents the human experience of this event. It represents why people celebrate it. It represents or it expresses the understanding of sequence of chain of events that led to celebration of death of somebody. The typical use of realist approach are biographies, oral history, or informants, when we ask people to inform us about what happened. And what is symptomatic for a realist approach is that medium, the narrative itself, or the language, is invisible, almost invisible. It doesn't interest us how people tell the story, because we are interested in the representation of events, what happened, what really happened. We are not interested in the way of they narrate it, because this is just a medium how to get into the source. This is the history. For example, in oral history, you want to know about subjective experience of past events, or in biographies. While in constructivist approach, we consider narrative as powerful means to create, to act, to construct meaning and impose it on object. We using narratives, we construct reality. It's not that we represent what happened, but we construct meaning of what happened. Because something happened, Osama bin Laden was killed, and by narrating about it, we construct a meaning, what it means, how we should understand it. So we act discursively. And in constructivist approach, the medium, language and language use is very important and is object of research, because the question is how some narrative could be created and why they picked these events to be, why this is the constructivist approach is focusing on guide in a cave, how guides act in a cave, what he decided to illuminate, if he is going rapidly through the cave, or if he is like shining on the ground, on the way, or above us. So the action, the performance of narrator is key of this approach. While in realist approach, what we are interested in most is the cave itself, the story, and we register these illuminated places, the spots, to create a map and to reconstruct the story, the cave. And so they don't contradict each other. First, we focus in realist approach. We focus on the story of what happened on the cave. In the second, we focus on narrator, on how narrator is created an impression of cave, how we perceive the cave, or how we perceive the story, how we understand after the tour, the guided tour, what understanding we have of the cave. And what to study in the narratives. So we had two approaches, and now what to study. You can study three elements or three issues: structure, content, or performance. You may remember from the class when we talked about about semiotics, that there are three branches of semiotics: semantics, syntactics, and pragmatics. The same applies to study of narrative. Narrative is symbolic communication, so we must take the division of semiotics and put it and apply it to study of narrative. Therefore, we have narrative syntax. We study structure of narratives, and we can study of naturally occurring personal event narratives, or we can study functional structure of narrative, myth or fairy tales, as Pope and Greymas. This is about structure, how it is organized, and what are invariant structures of narrative, what is same in all narratives of one kind, if there is something fixed or something universal for this kind of narrative. The second research or second focus is on narrative semantics, on the content of the stories that express experience of humans, experience of time, experience of transformations. So we can do hermeneutics of a biography, interpret personal experience, and what is the experience that is communicated through narrative. Or we can interpret the big narratives and look for what types of transformations are in narrative. For example, the narrative of nation history, or myths of nation history. What are events that happened? What revolutions? What violation of the primary state was there, and it turned to be the other way around. And so it's about the content of the story. What happened? And the third narrative, pragmatics is about using, about actions, how narratives are used in social life. So it's about performance in interviews of identity stories, or mapping interpretive communities through story genre, that different communities use different stories or a genre of stories. In some communities or in some situations we use jokes to tell what we want to communicate, what we want to communicate, using jokes. In other situation we cannot be joking, we must be serious, so we use chronicle or this way of telling the sequence of events. In some situations we cannot use narratives. In interview, in dialogue, in interrogation, we must say yes or not. We cannot use narrative, and this is about narrative pragmatics. And this will be the following lecture about narrative syntax, and the third will be about narrative pragmatics. if I shorten it, we have structural approach, hermeneutic approach, and interactive approach to narrative. Structures is about universal structures in narratives. Hermeneutic is about interpreting content, what is in the narrative, what is communicating through the narrative, and interactive approach is how narrative are permitted or necessary to use in some situation, and who can tell what story in the situation. Yes, that's all for the lecture, and now I will explain your homework. First, read the introduction in Seymour Chapman's book about narrative, story and discourse. This is in an introduction to narrative analysis. It's short and it's not complicated. So first. The second, analyze the declaration preceding the Constitution of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic from 1960, codifying the communist regime in Czechoslovakia. This is the declaration. It's a short text, just 3 pages, and you will analyze it. And the declaration is a kind of meta text that leads reader to correctly understand the Constitution itself. It's a form, it's a guide, implicit instructions, how to read the Constitution. The Constitution is articulated in a democratic diction, democratic terms, but the declaration makes the democratic terms somehow undemocratic. And this is the trick, to put introduction which says how you should read the law. And in this declaration you will look for narrative and non-narrative passages. Just underline as in the front page, just underline the narrative and non-narrative. You can underline just narrative passages, narrative chunks of text, and write down what indicators you used in making the distinction. How you discovered that, or why you think this or that is a narrative. The second task is to answer the question, how many stories are there? You know that we can have various narratives of the same story. We can have various guiding tour through one cave, this lamp illuminating just part of it. But there is one cave and many guides or many tours through it. My question is this declaration using one story or there are multiple stories? Third, what characters and actions are involved in stories? You can look for characters. So if I start, we working people. Working people is character. You can see it is an actor. Working people of Czechoslovakia declare. But we don't know if this is not a narrative passage. We, the working people of Czechoslovakia, declare. It's about what we do or what it's about doing. It's not recounting a sequence of events. So even if working people is an actor, it's not a part of story. You should identify only characters and actions involved in stories, in narrative or stories. Now you know that the working people is not a character in the first sentence. It could be an actor in a narrative passage, but the first sentence is not a narrative passage. And finally, what discursive means are used, or how the story is reordered in the narrative. If you find narrative passages, you can extract the story, and you can say, okay, so it's reordered. It's starting with the end, with the last event, and ending with the very first event, or it's just taking one actor of the story and forgetting the rest. So the question is how what is taken from the story into the narrative and what is not taken. Just few thought on it. It's homework. It's not to do analysis for your thesis. The instructions are in Moodle page. These instructions are in Moodle page with the course. The deadline is next Friday, so not tomorrow, but next Friday till midnight. And if you have questions regarding the homework, feel free to send me email, and I can answer you by email, or it's complicated. We can have a Skype chat, or I can answer it in question and answer module in Moodle, so to be available for everyone. Yes. Thank you for attention, and I'm looking forward to your homework.